Public. Okay. And we are live. Give that a couple seconds. So also just, there's a lag on it, but
Okay.
So whatever we say, people in the world see it like 5 to 10 seconds later.
Oh, okay. Yeah, because you're in real time.
Right.
You and I understand. Yeah.
Okay, so I've been calling this series What People Are Whispering About. The idea is that in today's world, there's a lot of conversations going on. And what I find, whether I'm in business or talking in social circles, there's too much conversation happening about people who are not in the room. So the overall idea is you are not going to get better at things if people keep talking in their own circles about people who are not in the room. And we all have our circles. I often talk about on this threads that in my personal circle, I was reading something about how the number one selling car in America is a pickup truck. So it then says that the number one selling car in America is a pickup truck. How many people in your circle have a pickup truck? And I did an audit. I know one person who owns a pickup truck. So we all have these ideas of, well, I know America. I know what's going on. I know a diverse crowd. But if we're honest enough and we take time to look at it, there's something missing in our crowd. So I come from a background of military personnel, minorities, academics, and let's just say we don't sit around talking about how we off-roaded our truck this weekend. At the same time, I'm fully aware that there's a part of America that doesn't know people like me exist. So that is really the overall premise of this discussion today. So so for those of you watching, I see we're getting some people ramped up here. That's the idea, having conversations across circles. So the person I'm talking to today, Thomas, I met Thomas online. I was actually working this map out in my head. So I met Thomas online through a posting that he had made regarding quarantine. But the person that I met him through is a person that I actually go to church with and have done men's groups things with. So how we came to be was a person that I know that is on, let's call it a very distant peripheral of my personal networks, but our overlap is going to church. You, I believe, if I remember correctly, also know this individual. So that was the connecting overlap. I often talk about networks and network theory. You've probably heard it yourself. Everybody's 6 degrees away from Kevin Bacon. Believe it or not, that's actually true mathematically. So that is our connection. I would say we are one, if not two, networks removed from each other to where our central networks are. Now, I'm living here in southeastern Wisconsin. Do I remember correctly that you are as well?
Yes, I live in Racine.
Okay, so
just north of you.
So I'm out here in Kenosha, sitting out here right now on the back deck at my mom's. So both same area. Now I'm not from Wisconsin. I've lived here, I'd say about 15 years now. How about you?
I'm originally from New York City. I was born in Brooklyn, New York. My father's family came from Ireland, and my mother's family from New Jersey. I went to high school in Florida. I left Florida several times in my 20s, kind of drifted around the country, never really settled anywhere, and moved to Wisconsin to finish a university degree, went to the University of Wisconsin. I moved here in 1993, and I have not left. I lived in Los Angeles for a little bit here about 10 years ago, but I was keeping apartments in both places. So originally from the East Coast, with a significant part of my life in Florida, and a really big significant part of my life here in Wisconsin.
Okay, so born Chicago, South Side Chicago myself. Folks were military. I then became military. So grew up as a military kid traveling this country. Grew up in a military family. From there, I went to the military academy, Coast Guard Academy. Transferred from Coast Guard to Army early on. So I finished out my military time in the Army. I got out of the Army in 2010. And then that's when I began my full-time private entrepreneurship, starting out in real estate, then getting in the service industry, owning restaurants, bars, things like that. Decided a couple of years after getting out, decided to use my veterans benefits, and I went back to school. So went back originally for business, so finished that up, then kept burning through those veterans benefits for econometrics and data science and statistics. And that is kind of how I started fashioning myself into the current life I live, where I argue I've always been an analyst or a consultant, even in a combat zone. Now it's more corporate, analyzing things, conflict is conflict. My personal touch is big into analyzing, researching, and applying behavioral economics. So the joke is that when people say you don't know me, I'm one of those guys that says, yes, I do. And here's the math to prove it. Really started out with larger firms like Capital One, who they came out of nowhere by using these kinds of mathematic techniques of pulling data. But now you're seeing everyone do it, from Facebook to Google to the one that most people know, Netflix. How does Netflix know what kind of movies you like before you even pick any movies? Those kinds of mathematical solutions. So what I do now on my off time, I try to engage the public about what's going on with technology, what technology is capable of, how firms are using technology, how they're using your data, what's capable of being done with your information that you give, even in a conversation. So when you're talking to Alexa, what can be done with that conversation when it's broken down and has math put behind it? So I try to engage people publicly about those items, but ultimately tying it back to this idea that while we're talking about technology and goings on and rioting, it comes down to people. While it's convenient to claim that the other side is animals and demons and dogs, people are people at the end of the day. That's one thing military time has taught me. I don't see anything unusual day in and day out. When I see people being hateful, when I'm seeing people being gracious, these are common things that I've seen no matter where I go in the world. So I try to share that idea to people of there's right things and wrong things that people do for their personal self-interest and benefit. But honestly, don't get surprised. I don't get surprised that often how people act, just from that time of bouncing around. You said you kind of drifted. Was never really a drifter. The military was a little bit more deliberate in the places that I went. But going to those many places and seeing those many kinds of people, one thing that jumped out to me very quickly was it's always the same. On the ground, they might think it's different. It's different names, different places. But when you step back, there's some pretty common ideas that are coming back and forth. So I wanted to just have a conversation with that and just start getting in with people. So let's go ahead and test this out in real time. So we got a question already. Dave wants to know, what program app are you using? That's an easy one for us to start off with. This is called StreamYard. I discovered this about a month or so with some guys that were live streaming, and I was coming on as a guest. And it was just such great how fluid that it was. And I was like, I got to know what this is. So I asked the guy what it was. And yeah, StreamYard, they have a free version, but I recommend just paying them the $30 a month. You can stream out to all these different places, and that's what I'm using now. So let's go ahead and get into it. So we had a recent conversation about let's take a small one and see where the conversation goes. So for those who don't know, here in here in Wisconsin, our capital is Madison. And like most of the country right now, there's a lot of, is it okay if I call it civil turmoil? There's a lot of civil turmoil right now. And there is a particular statue that was torn down. I actually, and correct me if I'm wrong, it was either torn down or it was vandalized. So I don't know if it was.
I think it was torn down and thrown in a lake.
Okay, so it was completely.
I'm assuming it's sunk.
Yeah. Well, actually, we can't assume that, but we'll dig into that later.
You never know.
Actually, let's dig into it now. If that one might have been, but so I was checking my data yesterday. So the 1,700 Confederate monuments that were put up between 1920 and 1970 here in the U.S., they were put up so quickly, and they were put up by people who didn't have a lot of money. They just wanted to get them out there. The majority of them are cast. They're hollow. So a lot of those actually might float, depending on how you chuck them in.
Right.
So,
yeah.
They weren't looking for truly artistic. They just wanted to plant their no pun intended. The Confederates wanted to plant their flag all over the nation. So this one is not a Confederate flag. So that's why I said it may, maybe not. This particular gentleman, for Wisconsin history, and I keep forgetting his name, so we're just going to talk about him in generalities until I go Google it in a second.
It's Hans Christian Heg, and it's easy to remember because you have Hans Christian Andersen. I wouldn't remember it either if it wasn't the some kind of an association.
So what he's known for, the reason why he had a statue built, is he is a Wisconsinite, and he is credited for the state of Wisconsin of being one of the forefathers of the Wisconsin prison system. But as far as his personal life, he has historical evidence accounting of him being a staunch abolitionist to the point where he helped slaves become free. And I believe I read a story where even when he was confronted saying, turn over that slave, he refused. So in his personal life, he has these accolades to his accounting, both speaking publicly against slavery during these times. So I believe his time frame was around the 1830s, if I remember correctly. So before Civil War, where he starts coming onto prominence, but his career went past the Civil War. So the statue is, I argue, is probably put up to commemorate him for being one of the founding fathers of the Wisconsin prison system. So this statue was torn down. So as a result of this, there was a lot of conversation that immediately sprung up using this as proof that the current going on of tearing down statues has nothing to do, little to nothing to do with tearing down the wrong statues. The argument that's being presented is that this is just solely people who just hate history for the sake of hating history. And they won't be happy until everything good has been destroyed. This is opening presents that we're engaging on. So I say, let's just pick up from there. The statue of a guy who did good things. For some things, we can definitely agree were good. And some other things I'd like to dig into. His statue was torn down during a time that many are arguing is a continuation or a second wave of the civil rights movement.
Well, so the way we got here is I had posted one of my familiar expressions. I say, can somebody smarter than me explain this? And as flippant as it sounds, I honestly am soliciting an opinion that may help me sort of understand why in a civil protest in the current atmosphere, why would we deface, destroy, vandalize, or tear down a statue commemorating, say, a person who did good or more good than bad. And I mean, I understand that in the melee of a protest, there's going to be collateral damage. Things get broken, trees get burnt down. Nobody hates trees, but the thing is that I think that it probably many folks are scratching their head and saying, "Well, wait. I mean, if it was a statue of somebody who had perpetuated, um, say, racist ideology or racism, well, sure, that's understandable. But in this particular statue, um, the question becomes, well, what were they thinking? And honestly, I don't know who actually put their hands on it. So we don't really know the circumstances. We just know how it ended.
Well, let's keep it as simple as we can for this conversation. I'm pretty sure you weren't there when it went down, and I know I wasn't there. So I'm going to talk from my own voicing. I wasn't there when it was torn down. I didn't collaborate with the people who tore it down. But I'm sitting here now, and I'm not going to say that I don't care, but I will say that I could see a reason why not to care. And I am sitting here now more than willing to talk about why I'm not convinced completely that this guy did more good than bad. I am sitting here saying now that he is one of the forefathers of the Wisconsin prison system. The Wisconsin prison system is the worst prison system for minorities in America. It is so bad with the systems that they use that there's entire academic papers written about it. Wisconsin does a lot of things, but one of the things that's very unique about Wisconsin is Wisconsin said, well, to prove that we're not racist, we're going to start deciding who goes to jail and who doesn't using these computer algorithms. So they hired a firm out of California to build these algorithms, and they decide sentencing, and they even decide parole when people get out. Well, here's the problem. The company is a proprietary company, and they refuse to share these algorithms with the public so they can be analyzed. I do this for a living. I can tell you this right now. You can hard code bias into something. Just because a machine is saying it doesn't mean it's not biased. There's a lady who wrote a book called Weapons of Math Destruction, Kathy O'Neill. She actually testified before the Senate House Committee about 4 months ago to this fact, where if someone doesn't want to hire women, they can write an algorithm that just doesn't pick women. And not only can they do it deliberately, you can actually do it accidentally, which we don't have to get into the math too far this early in the conversation. But the facts are this. The reason why Wisconsin is on the map is while they don't share the algorithm, we can see the outcomes. So the public data of who gets out of jail and how long they went in. So an independent group of data scientists, volunteers, culled through the data for Wisconsin. Here's what they found. A white person who is given a more lenient sentencing in Wisconsin is 60% more likely to reoffend using this algorithm. A black person who's giving a harder sentencing is 60% less likely. What does that mean? That means that this algorithm that's being used in Wisconsin, let's say you're a black person, you're a first-time offender, it holds you to a higher standard than it holds a repeat white offender, to where it's not even close. It is just astronomically different. You get longer sentencing and you get tougher sentencing for the level and severity of the crimes, to where you have entire zip codes in Milwaukee, where the majority of the African Americans in Wisconsin reside, Milwaukee County, to where you have up to 60% of the males over the age of 16 have prison records. Now, understandably so, someone might say, well, hey, you do the crime, you do the time. It's a fair statement to start out with. But then we continue with the research. I'm going to take a simple one. You'll often hear people say that about, crime. But if you think about it, we do not have crime statistics. We have reported crime statistics. You don't know how many rapes happened. You know which rapes were reported. So, for example, it's pretty well documented that the majority of the time when men are raped by other men, they don't report it. So even though we know a lot of it's happening, the reporting is very small. We look at this with drug usage. You go to the, let's call it the poor and black minority side of town, you have a lot of evidence of the police arresting people for drinking in public all the way up to drug usage. So people will say, well, that's evidence. These are where the people who commit more crimes live. Here's the challenge I put out to you. Give me a police squad and let me start hitting up University of Wisconsin-Madison on Friday and Saturday night. Let me start kicking in some dorm rooms. I promise you, I will bump up the white crime statistics. Let me start going to those places where there's majority white, and let me start going actively pursuing crime, and I guarantee you I will not have to plant evidence. Those crime stats will come up. So what I'm saying is the evidence overwhelmingly shows that across ethnicities, drug usage is about the same. I'm not a toker myself, but I rarely don't have a wine bottle near me, so I'm not judging. But as aggregate groups, white people and black people smoke marijuana about the same. So the fact that most of the people you have in jail for smoking marijuana or for using marijuana or for selling it, that is only an indication on who you are targeting or who you are catching. It is not an indication of who is using. So coming back to the prison system, I didn't tear the statue down, but if you tell me that a guy is one of the founding fathers of this meat grinder that is the Wisconsin prison system, I'm good with it.
Well, let's pick a let's put this in the context of time. So, and I don't know when he died. I don't necessarily know the span of his life, but as you said, Civil War, pre-Civil War, so mid 1800s.
Pretty confident he didn't live to see 1900.
Probably not. So if a group of people are getting jazzed up in a protest and start to decide that they're going to start tearing stuff up, breaking things, burning things, etc. And let's just assume that this was not a premeditated act, right? Let's just assume it was a casualty in a melee, a protest that turned destructive. Let's assume that based at least on what I've read and know. So now this fellow, I've heard this argument by several people. Well, you know, he was one of the founding. He was a prison commissioner. I don't know what work he did to found a prison system, but let's just pick a year, 1860. Well, he died in the Civil War. Actually, he died. He was injured in battle and died. I just remember that. So let's say in 1855. What do we know about the Wisconsin prison system? If the Wisconsin prison system is broken now, and this man's legacy was two things that we've identified: his objection to slavery and his active works, not just words in that regard. And he was a prison commissioner for Wisconsin, and maybe he was significant in developing the prison system. It doesn't even remotely resemble what we have today. I've thought about this for a couple of days. I think that in this particular case, the statue is collateral damage. It's casualty. It's torn down. Maybe there's people today going, "Holy shit! I didn't even know who the hell that was."
But I'm saying, we don't have to focus on them. Let's focus on my reaction. Let's ask me, why don't I care? So what you're talking about is what I call it. They did the right thing for the wrong reason. So maybe They were just tearing down statues just to tear down statues. I
think that's what happened.
I'm saying, why don't I care? I don't care because I'm saying you didn't tear down one I cared about. And the reason why I didn't care about it is, so I think I hear what you're saying, where the guy died in 1863. How can he be held accountable for things that happened after his death? We do that all the time. Obama wrote more executive orders than any other president up until Trump. But at the time, I mean, pencil whipped. That was only possible because of Bush and the Patriot Act. All that surveillance stuff, all the Snowden stuff, yes, Obama did it. But it was only possible because of the 2003 Patriot Act of Bush. Did Bush know that Obama was going to go into office and do that? No. He is still responsible, his administration rather. We see this all the time where, let's see how well you are with this one, Stephen. I can't remember the guy's name. The guy who shot the prince of the Austrian prince, Franz Ferdinand. He was with the Black Hand. He shot this guy. Did he have any way of knowing that he was going to start World War I and result in the deaths of millions? Probably not. Doesn't change the fact that most educated historians say he was the most influential man of World War I, if not the 20th century. That one act and what it precipitated carrying down the line. So I argue, no, it is not a requirement that you know or even expect to know the outcomes of your actions in order for you to be responsible for it. So I'm not saying this proves for a fact that this guy is the reason why blacks are incarcerated more than whites, but it doesn't change the possibility that he very well could have built the machine that someone else twisted and used. So yes, it was following Reconstruction. Oh, there we go. Gavrilo Princip. Yeah, that's why I can never remember.
Yeah, nice.
So that's the idea of you don't need to know the future in order to be responsible for it. And we see this happening where, yes, Reconstruction happened or it failed because backed out. And then you saw across the nation new laws being created. Okay, fine. They're free. What are we going to do about it?
All right. So let me extend this out a little further. Let's say you have an act of terrorism, domestic terrorism, international terrorism, whatever the case may be. And I'm going to keep this really simple. The perpetrators of that act were purposely targeting the people that they feel were responsible for whatever transgressions were being bestowed upon them, past or present. Now, I have a little bit of background in this, in that I come from a family on my father's side that came from Belfast. And if you were a Catholic in Belfast, then you lived under a different set of rules. The history speaks for itself, how the British treated the people, the Irish Catholics in Belfast. So if you drive a car into a crowd of people and you detonate that bomb, which happened in the Northern Ireland conflict, in one particular case, the Armagh bombing I'm speaking of, and you kill people that indiscriminately, right? You don't know how many people. Now that bomb went off accidentally, but let's just say that's an intentional bombing. The bomb was intended for another target. Let's say it's an intentional bombing and you kill people who otherwise sympathize with your cause or may be completely on board. So what you've done is you've killed people unintentionally or intentionally, depending on how you want to look at it, who may have been on your side of things. So if we wantonly destroy a city square and there's 5 statues and, well, all 5 statues got tore down because it was chaos. And 2 of those statues, let's just say, were beyond reproach, absolutely 100% not the statue you want to tear down. Going back to my original post, when I say, can people smarter than me explain this, that's kind of where I'm going. You know, on the surface, you say, On the surface, it's a what the fuck moment. Now, why would you tear down that statue?
So
Now, we're learning more as we go, right?
We got to dig into your definition of terrorism. So first off, I do have a little bit of experience with terrorists, and I will tell you this. They are training manuals of a particular set. We're going to go through a couple. When, let's just take a radical Muslim extremist, if they blow up a bomb, and even if they know they're killing other Muslims, their attitude is that the cause is higher than those people.
Sure. Yeah.
They will call those people martyrs. Mm-hmm. Even though they weren't voluntary martyrs, they will call them martyrs.
Right.
They are not the only ones who do this. What you find with terrorism, so let's first define terrorism. Terrorism is leveraging acts of violence to sway public political opinion. Mm-hmm. So we need to make sure we keep that in context. What is the difference between a postal worker who gets fired and shoots up the room and a guy who hates the government and shoots up the room? The guy who shoots up because he hates the government is a terrorist. The guy who got fired just snapped. They are not both terrorism. Right. They terrorize, but they're terrorism. So when we talk about these people tearing down the statues, we need to ask that question. Was the statue torn down and an act of violence against people to sway public opinion? I'm not seeing that happening here.
I agree. I don't think it was happening that way either. I think that, and I'm going to probably get in trouble for this one because as somebody pointed out recently, I'm an old guy. But when I was young, impulsive, idealistic, or however you want to characterize it. If I were involved in a protest of something, maybe just tearing down a structure or a statue, I wouldn't have thought twice about. It's in the moment, right? And but I do believe that in this particular case, it was just a casualty of the moment. Now, could have a couple of young people said, hey, there's that guy who started the Wisconsin prison system. He's coming down. And does somebody object and say, oh, yeah, but wait, his record? No, I don't think any of that happened. I think that it was just in the moment. And in that same evening, somebody pointed out on my post, a local, a local representative, I think it was a congressman, was beaten. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Yeah, I got punched. Yeah. So,
I mean, there was a lot going on that night, and maybe this statue was the least of it. Who knows?
So, so here's what I look at. This conversation about what was their pathology. That's what we're doing right now. We're trying to understand their mindset. What was their pathology? Right. I don't hear this conversation in white mainstream America when the white kids tear up their own school or their own city after their college football team wins. We have seen the video of their team wins. They start flipping cars. They start tearing down street poles. I have never heard this conversation of what were they thinking? And I argue the reason why we don't hear that is we immediately see petty crime is petty crime. There is not a terrorist group. We don't call these kids terrorists. When their college football team wins or even Major League Football and they flood the streets and tear up the city, and we have it persistent. Chief of police, just some young kids blowing off steam.
I lived in Los Angeles when the Lakers won the championship, and my apartment was about 1.25 miles I lived on the west side of downtown Los Angeles, and I had a third floor balcony, second or third floor. And I remember the news reports from downtown, which is just walking distance, and kind of thinking the same thing, like, okay, so it was a great series, great game, great final game. I say we because I lived in LA and I kind of got on board with the team. So we win, and now we have complete chaos. And I remember asking at the time, like, well, wait a minute, what the hell?
But I'm talking about the response to it. Similar thing. people tearing things up, and it doesn't make sense. I've been observing social media conversation for years now, and this is more recent. We've seen basketball teams win the Final Four. They make it to the Sweet 16. They make it through Final Four. I'm not seeing this conversation when they tear things up. Like, what are these kids thinking? Can someone explain to me? So that's my first concern. My second concern is, again, the use of certain words. Words have meaning. So when we say terrorism, that, in my opinion, is not an appropriate word for anything that we're seeing. I am not seeing, and I argue, even if I agree with your movement or not, if you are using violence to sway public opinion, it's terrorism. Even if you're doing it for a good cause, terrorism is terrorism. You're terrorizing people to get them to change their minds. I'm not seeing that. What I'm seeing is an actual movement that is not asking you to change your mind. I'm seeing the BLM movement as saying, we're done with the shit. There is no official BLM movement, but what I observe is a movement saying this should have been handled in the 80s. It wasn't handled by the adults. This should have been handled in the 70s and the 60s. It wasn't handled. I see a movement saying all these older people should have handled this, but you didn't. We're fed up. I don't see them asking to come to the table. I don't see them saying, let's work on a timeline. I see them saying, these older generations we think are full of crap because this racial stuff, it seems we all agree it shouldn't exist. The problem is it does. And I'm 38 years old. The way I look at it, I'm dealing with this because older generations didn't have the courage to handle it properly. It's like you started a thing with the Civil War, and then you just let it fester and get worse instead of completing the job. We then get to the civil rights movement, and again, you look at what happened in Germany with Nazis, rounded up, Nuremberg trials, even Nazi collaborators following World War II, even the women who slept with Nazi soldiers. We have the video of them being their heads shaved. I'm not even saying I agree with it. My point is, it was all the way through. Here in America, Martin Luther King takes a bullet to the neck in '68. America allowed Tennessee, and when I say allow, they didn't say nothing. They didn't protest. Tennessee puts up a golden bust of Nathan Bedford Forrest in the Capitol 2 years later, after King takes a bullet to the neck. That same America then sits back and lets the people who made such statues make more statues, put them up in public places. So what I'm seeing now is this attitude of the younger generation being soft or something, or, hating history. Half of this history should have never existed. If I was speaking to the older generations collectively, I would say, shame on you. We shouldn't even be dealing with this. You should have handled this when it first popped its ugly head right back up. To the point where, as I said earlier, most of the people clamoring about these statues, so I didn't know this guy or his name, and I still couldn't remember it. These Confederate statues, most people don't even know that they weren't put up immediately after the Civil War. Most people are not aware they were put up in two time periods, right after the NAACP was founded and right after the Civil Rights Movement. So does that mean 100% certain these were not a response to those things? I'll give you that. It's not 100%. But I need to hear a damn good story to tell me that it was something other than saying to the Black Americans, we're not giving up yet. And moreover, while that might have been a small subset of America, there was a larger part of America, which Martin Luther King called the moderate whites in his letter from Birmingham, that sat by and just let the discussion happen. So if I had to throw out some fake numbers, I would say that, let's say 5-10% of Americans are actively, I hate Black people, at the most. or they were raised at a dinner table where their daddy talked that way. We have a larger segment, 30-40%, that just sits there silently while it's happening. And that's really what I'm seeing happening right now, where this newer generation is saying, we're not going to just sit there on the side like our forefathers did. And what I'm seeing is their fathers and their forefathers not understanding that, yeah, and that's an opinion. That's not a fact. That's me stating an opinion that we shouldn't be talking about this today in 2020. Previous U.S. citizens should have handled this 50 years ago.
Well, 50 years ago, there was a lot going on. And I think that I think anybody that's in the age of, say, my parents are 75 and 83. I'm 56. I think that a lot of people who did a lot of good works, who dedicated their lives to in the era of the civil rights movement. I mean, if they're alive today hearing you, they might say, well, as an individual, I did all I can. I think you're referring to the collective. And when you speak of the collective group, what can, if you have 1 million people still alive who gave everything to the civil rights movement, and we know that Martin Luther King really gave everything, well, then they may take objection to the inference that perhaps they either sat on their hands. And I know I don't think you mean that about those people. I think when we talk about why there's not been the change, I mean, what I hear you say is we need a reset button. And I do like what you said about Nazi Germany. They saw it all the way through. It has to be, it's really institutionalization of various aspects of our society that present, or I should say prevent, any kind of grassroots movement from getting any kind of real traction. That we got what we got in the 60s, I think, is remarkable. So why is it not happening today? I think, to your point, there's a large percentage of people that don't do anything.
So here's what I see. So how you said about Martin Luther King gave all. I remember a guy once asked me, where are your black leaders? And my response to him was, in the ground where you put them. Martin Luther King was not the only one killed. Oh, systematically. You say most survived. For the black community, no, they didn't. They didn't survive. The few that did survive, like John Lewis, that's why they made it to Congress, because the fact that you survived it is amazing. So I argue there's more people doing something now than before. The 60s and 70s, what I see is video of people sitting there watching their TV. The black community was out in the streets. And yes, there were some strong, staunch allies, but they were the few. They were not the norm. They were not the average. What I see here today is we have an America that takes credit as a whole for what a very few people did. It is no way possible that the majority of Americans who were alive during that time that are white were supportive of Martin Luther King when they were doing polls during the time, and he was not a popular man. We no pun intended, we whitewash history during that time, and we pretend like all the racists were swept up in the racist rapture. And the only ones that are left are a couple hillbillies down south, Dixie Democrats. It's a complete fabrication. The people didn't disappear. They continued to raise children. They continued to train their sons at the dinner table to think how they think. They may not be as bold, but we are seeing it every day as technology gets better. Cops being caught with hot mics saying we're going to get the blacks. These people didn't go away. So this narrative that everybody loved Martin Luther King, it's a farce. The man had several attempts on his life. Only one of them was a mentally unstable black woman. So even how we try to spin this idea that everybody loved Martin Luther King except for that one guy, it's not true. He was a hated man, absolutely hated. The civil rights movement, no matter how peaceful it was hated. It was always, why can't you guys be more patient? Why can't you wait? Why are you trying to push things? So those people are still alive and their children are still alive. And I argue that is what we don't confront out in the open. The races did not just disappear in the smoke, and their children did not just become healed when Martin Luther King died. And the proof again is how many of those busts got put up after he took the bullet in the neck. I could take it if once Martin Luther King got shot, not a single additional Confederate monument went up. But they kept going up. They kept going up. And the majority white America, because right now it's just math. I think right now we're still 63% white Caucasian for America. Latins are catching up. I think currently the demographics have another 5 years before they come the largest group. But right now, that's what I mean when I say aggregate. Sure, it was only 2 or 3 people who put up the statue, and it might have been only 300 or 400 who chipped in the money. But it took hundreds of thousands of Americans to tolerate it. And that's the thing that I argue that right now, this is a reckoning. That's what I see. It's a reckoning of things that should have been settled before, but they weren't. In business, we have this concept of technical debt, where if you don't take care of it today, it's just going to be a bigger problem later down the road. I'm looking at technical debt. These things would have been a lot cheaper for us to handle back then. We didn't handle it. And now we're seeing a heavier cost to where I don't think me and you are disagreeing. I don't think either of us thinks the people who tore that statue down knew who it was. I'll even go a step further and say it since you did it. I bet it was just a group of people who were like, you know what? There's a statue of a white guy. He was probably a racist. Let's rip it down. Even though everyone had a smartphone, no one bothered to Google it.
Right.
Statistically, I think they made a good guess. Statistically, the fact that you have so many Confederates, the fact you have so many forefathers, and the fact that, again, if we're honest, we have more years of America with slavery and with racial segregation than we have without it. So I really don't understand why we pretend that you could, let's pretend America's a person. You can be a thing for 40 years, and then if you clean up your act for 2 weeks, you want a trophy. This is not going to be done, and it's not going to be settled by allowing the two to survive. And I write about this a lot, where I think this is a culture war. We talk about white and black a lot, but if you look out in those streets, it's not like the 70s. It's not a sea of black people with a couple Bernie Sanders types walking alongside them. I'm watching the state of Washington State and Oregon. That's a sea of white people out marching, out protesting. This is something completely different, to where even though it's about race, I argue it's a culture war about race. What was tolerated in previous generations is not being tolerated by this new culture. To the fact that even me, there's things that I tolerate that this younger generation is not tolerating. There's levels to racism. I go to church with people that I know are not KKK members, but I know that if we ever had a conversation about race, I would find out how much we're not brothers. So I've been raised in America to go to church with men that I just don't start those conversations because I don't want to go there. I don't want to start a scene in church. This younger generation, they're giving me the motivation to start holding people accountable now. We're like, nah, man, explain yourself. We go to church every Sunday. What did you mean when you say that? I'm now doing that. And that's me being inspired by this newer generation. So that's why for me, the bigger picture is I'm okay with this younger generation not playing half measures the way that generations before them have. We talk a good game. We talk about this being the freedom place, but we have not practiced that at all. And anyone who's honest about how our nation looks, they could argue that it's not 100% fact, but you can't look at how this nation is shaped up and claim that we truly live that all men are created equal.
I wouldn't disagree with that. When it's institutionalization of these institutions that are like a tanker that takes miles and miles to come to a complete stop. They put the brakes on, I don't know how far out, 40, 50 miles out before they have to come to port. And because of so much cargo weight. So if you take from the civil rights movement onward, you're into the about 60-year mark, right? I was born in 64. That puts me at 56. So you're really looking at a 60-year window. I don't necessarily see it as an abject failure, although I think to your point, there's this massive gap between the groundswell that we saw, and then you have this leveling and then a serious dip really through the 70s and 80s, which I vividly remember. I was there. There's this dip, right? And then now we're seeing maybe this same kind of a groundswell, but I don't necessarily believe that there wasn't a lot of progress made, but there's a large gap. You've alluded to that a couple of times, and the gap.
We both have to agree that anyone, and if I come out the way I need to back up, I'm not going to say nothing was done. Absolutely, we can't claim that. I can't claim that how I live life today is no different than how blacks lived in 1963. So, of course, there's been progress. I guess where I'm holding us more accountable is that, actually, I use this analogy a lot. I've had white people come up to me and say, you have to admit you live better than your people did in the 60s. You got to give us that credit. Here's my response. You know what a white guy in 2020 doesn't do? Compare his life to a forefather in 1920. He doesn't sit there and say, well, you know what? I'm making more than my great-great-great-grandfather, and I don't work 14-hour days and there's labor law. So at least there's that. What people do is they compare themselves to the people around them in real time. So think about it this way. You go into the office and your boss calls into his office and he says, you know what, man? Loving what you're doing, 20% raise effective immediately. You're like, wow, 20% raise, that's awesome. You walk out of his office. You find out that he gave every other employee a 50% raise. How would you feel?
Well, right. This is
this is what it's been doing to the black community.
It's a rhetorical question, but
it's the 20% raise when you gave everybody else a 50% raise. I want to be treated like everybody else. I don't want to be treated better than myself a minute ago. I don't want to be treated better than my daddy back in the 40s or the 50s or the 60s. I want to be treated like you are treated right now. So when I say what has not been dealt with is that fact and that reality. If you think about it, it's no different than the people who are interviewing Martin Luther King asking him, why not just be patient? If I say I want to make what you make and you say, well, just give it some time, you'll get to that dollar amount eventually. You're telling me to be patient. I can never have what you have when you have it. I'll get there someday. But by the time I get there, you'll be somewhere else newer. I'm saying that something like that doesn't require 60 years. Either you're going to do it or you're not. I try to make things about business and tech in these conversations. Never in my life in business has someone said to me, if you give it to me for free or less than cost now, I'll pay full price the next time. Have they told the truth? Anybody that's not willing to pay me what I'm worth on the front side they'll never pay me what I'm worth later.
Yeah, I understand. I run a business, and my partner and I have this discussion regularly.
So
You know,
you know what
there,
I'm talking about
there's
in
a
business.
temptation to go in low because you want the work, you need the work. And he always tells me, you just set the bar, and that's where you're going to start the next time around. You're starting from there.
And
It's
let's
not
keep
what
it
you
on the
want to make.
business thing. You know, in business, if I walk in as a vendor for your business and you ask me how much, and I say 75 to 125, what number did you hear?
75.
So I tell people that if you give this world a range, they're going to hit the bottom every single time. Know what you're worth and say that. So coming back to this movement, no, I don't want the number you have. I don't want the bottom range, and I don't want it spread out over time. I want to be treated like you are right now. I want you to look at me the way you look at your brother. And if that's not reasonable, then I'm okay with that at a freedom level. But I'm not going to pretend that we're friends. I'm not going to pretend that you're my friend. If it is unreasonable for when you see some black kids tearing down a statue, to not look at them the same way when you see some white kids tearing down a statue after their basketball team won. If that is not a reasonable request, that makes us enemies. You know, in Army, there was a level of civility to where there was a time there, I remember a day literally having dinner with the enemy, having dinner with guys that we knew killed our guys. But there's rules to all that. I look at what's going on now and how I live my life. So I have professed out loud, I am part of Black Lives Matter. So when you talk about Black Lives Matter, you're talking about me. So please talk to me if I'm in the hear shot. I'm pretty confident you're not going to see me tearing down a statue. I'll ruin my suit. So I guess what I look at this is there's many ways to protest. My way of protest, I personally choose is an economic one, to where I draw a line in the sand. You're either with me or you're against me. There's no in between. Coming back to how I was more tolerant, I used to do business with people that were not with me. I used to say I just have to do that to get by. Now, I don't want your business and I don't want your money. I'd rather figure out another way to feed my kids, and I'd rather make sure I don't feed your family. Because as my earlier point, these younger people that have these racist intentions, I don't know if you saw that article today, these cops just got fired because they were caught hot mic'd. They were not 90 years old. They were not 70 years old. These were 30s. Well, one guy had 30 years in, so he was in his 50s, but the others were younger, which means they were raised up into this heritage after the movement. I am now holding myself accountable to not feed the families of men who raise children like that. And that's what I am more aware of right now. As me and you are speaking right now, there is a man raising children around a dinner table with the same mentality as those 3 cops that were just fired. Now, here's what you would have to work very hard to convince me. You hear people say, well, there's racism on both sides. I do not see evidence that there's a black father right now raising up his children saying, hate white people just because they're white. I believe that there's black fathers having conversations that I'm having, saying, you need to beware. You need to realize some people hate you just because how you look. You need to be alert. You need to be ever vigilant. But no, I do not believe that there is a sea of black fathers telling their children, hate white people just because. So when people say it's the same on both sides, like our president, I call bullshit.
I don't disagree with with your statement, and because I've had interpersonal relationships with black people, people in my family are Hispanic, I've I don't disagree with what you're saying that on balance, if not in the majority, if not all the cases, that there aren't black fathers or mothers telling their daughters or sons that what, just as you had said, but the converse of that being the case, right, where they're taught that. But if we've had the better part of 60 years with this being like I say, we had a gap, right? We had a large groundswell in the beginning, a gap. Now we're seeing, as you said, um, a resurgence, and I think, as you said, it's more of a cultural. It's also a cultural warfare. It's and as you said, a reckoning. So, um, I I don't know how, and this might be good for the next topic. I don't know how um, the MO that we've seen, and I don't know if this is, we'll see more of it, less of it, the same. I don't know. I don't know, and I don't have the answer tonight on how to fix it, turn it around. Um, but whenever you have violence, I think that the initial pushback can be counterproductive. I'm not saying that it can lead to change, but I am seeing, and I'm like you, I'm observing what I see on social media. I don't see anybody sort of getting on board with it. And if that's just the tip of the iceberg, does that mean that the 40 or 60%, as you mentioned, that sit back and don't do anything, did that advance them towards or away from embracing some sort of a plan moving forward for change? I don't know what that plan is. We're very early in the process here, the last several weeks, right? Who knows what this looks like a year from now? Maybe it's like what you've touched on, a year from now, because we get our news from the media, and more so now than ever with social media. Maybe a year from now, this is backbenched by some other major headline. Maybe there's world conflict. Maybe there's a climate change comes back. I don't know. Um, I understand when you say, well, I'm down with the young folks who are, they're like the Twisted Sister song, "We're not going to take it anymore." But what's the end game? Where does this lead? So maybe the next convo we can maybe pick up on, where does this take us from here? Because unfortunately, most people's impression of what's happening does not come from being there. It comes from seeing it on the news or social media, right? I wasn't in Madison that night, so I'm hesitant to go into depth about what happened because I wasn't there. I also wasn't, also wasn't in Milwaukee, although I live only 20 miles south, on the nights when there was civil unrest. So the question is this an effective means to move forward? I can tell you just from growing up in the era of what they call the Troubles in Ireland, there were plenty of people that were down with the cause, but weren't down with all the methods. So when you have an event like you had in Armagh, where a bomb accidentally goes off and inadvertently kills people that it was not intended for, it drove a lot of people away from the ideology because of the carnage. And it was an accident, although it was intended for a target. It wasn't this one. And really, so far with destruction of property, we can argue, okay, so what, right? It's a statue. It's a 100-year-old tree, a dilapidated house, or whatever the case may be. But a lot of people did lose a lot in the last couple of weeks, and I don't know that it advances the cause forward. And again, I don't have all the answers, but I don't know that that's the one that's going.
I guess the way I see it. So let's talk about the people who lost or maybe were turned off by these events. I argue that these people were the people who weren't won when the man was killed. Let's just do the chronology. A man was murdered in broad daylight. These people watched it, and they're like, that's horrible, that's terrible. But they didn't really give a shit. Personally. Happened to a guy. That's horrible. So if you watch a man being murdered in the street, another U.S. citizen, and it doesn't trigger you, honestly, I argue there's nothing that can be done to win you over. So coming back to business, not everybody's a customer. That customer's almost right. Only people who believe that are people who haven't gone out of business yet.
Right.
When I wake up and I check my phone, I don't have a newspaper anymore. I check my phone for the news, and I see that 3 or 4 American soldiers were killed in Afghanistan. I take that personal. Even though I haven't been there, even though I don't know these guys, they're my guys. They're on my team. When I saw George Floyd being killed, that was my guy on my team. Coming back to that reckoning, there is a large part of America that even though they claim they don't see color, even though they claim they treat all U.S. citizens equal, they watched that man being killed and they didn't have that trigger response that I did. They did not see one of their own being killed. And how do we know this? They were the ones online saying, it happened in Minneapolis. Why are people rioting in California? It happened in Minneapolis. Why are people rioting in Atlanta? These were the people saying that, because not only did they not care, they didn't understand why other Americans care. Now, when they saw other blacks doing it, that was, oh man, they're going to make this about race. There's no proof it was about race, because they live in this fantasy world that if the cop didn't literally say, I'm killing this man because he's black, then we can't say that it has anything to do with race. They live in that magical little world. But then when they started seeing people who are not black protesting, then they're like, what is going on? This makes no sense. I argue that we can talk about being U.S. citizens all day, but if you see me bleeding out and you don't respond, there is nothing I can do to lose you. I never had you. We were never on the same team. So if I do something later that you're like, oh, that kind of turns me off, I don't know how you're going to win me over, I literally could die and I would not win you over. You're a lost cause for me at this moment. Now I say at this moment, because I'm a Zig Ziglar man. There's no such thing as a no, just a not right now. Right now at this moment, I could die and I still would not have you championing my cause. Therefore, I'm not really going to worry about what you think I should do for the cause. Because I could lose my whole life and you don't give a shit. And that's what I'm viewing right now. Now, to your point about people reacting, I actually am seeing more people get from the sidelines. I'm seeing large companies. I'm seeing people I never would have thought get involved saying, I'm making a stand.
Well, yeah, we see that a lot. And I think more so than in my memory. I don't count the 60s. I was a child. I don't have a big picture recollection and understanding, but I would say through the 70s and 80s and where we're at today, I would say I would agree. There's much more of it. I have to split.
No worries, sir. Good conversation.
Appreciate it. I'd like to do it again. It can continue on this theme. Probably what intrigues me most about what you said tonight would be really probably the last thing that you said in response to me saying, will these actions create the change? Will it get people on board who maybe weren't before? I'd like to pick it up again with that one.
Absolutely. We'll pick up with that on the Ray's idea of lost cause. Is it real or not?
Right on. Well,
Fair
thanks
enough,
again,
sir.
Man.
No worries. Thanks for coming on, and thanks for everyone else for listening and joining on next time. And also, just so anyone knows, while I do these things, anyone can come in if you want to have these conversations. I can invite you in. We go live. I really want to make this important. The bigger picture here is nothing gets fixed through disconnection.
How does somebody get, how do you get, let's say you're watching this, how do they join in?
So the link, so I sent you the link, right, through private message.
Right.
Let's say one of your buddies was like, hey, man, I want to jump in. You just forward him that link. He comes into the studio.
Okay.
Anyone could write on the side here through the thing saying, hey, I want in on this conversation. I send them the link. You send them the link. They're in.
Okay.
I think that's how it should be. You know, big boy rules. You want to speak, but this is not scripted. This is in real time. Let you talk. Hopefully you can stand on your own.
Right on. I think we did good, man. We've been talking through messaging for a couple of weeks. It was good to have this conversation.
I think it's good to have the conversation, and I think it's more important to have them open in public for the benefit of us all. So again, thank everyone for listening, and tune in for the next one.
Okay, man. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.